So, new criticism. What is this thing that I'm talking about, right? The contemporary study of literature, at its most basic, is the practice and cultivation of critical and creative reading practices. This has not always been the case, however. Though we could trace theories of poetry, of what it is, how it works, and why it can be dangerous, even, back to the ancient Greeks, namely to philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, what it meant to study literature in the modern university, both as a student and as a professional scholar, underwent a major shift less than 100 years ago. Our story this semester is, in a sense, not only about different ways to interpret literature, not only about those categories I went over in my last video, but also about the aftermath of this shift. What we might call the development or even the disaggregation of English as an academic field, that is, as something you can major and minor in. If we begin with this shift, which didn't occur all at once, but over the course of the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, and even 1950s, then our story begins, as stories tend to begin in classes like this, with the rise of what is still referred to, often ironically, as new criticism, or somewhat awkwardly as the new criticism. Ironic because new criticism is now 80 years old. Ironic too because scholars tend to crinkle up their noses whenever it's mentioned or defended or praised. Though this method of literary study, new criticism, fell out of favor some time ago, its legacy nevertheless remains intact, since many literature courses, including the ones I teach, are dedicated to the cultivation of skills like close reading, the evaluation and explanation of textual evidence. What's in the text? If you ever had a literature professor say to you, but where is it in the text? Right? That is a development of new criticism. And the shift in one's attention away from what works of literature are about, or what their messages or morals might be, to how works of literature work. Through what play of form, structure, and signification they achieve what we might call somewhat crudely their literariness, or their artfulness, or somewhat more simply, their meaning, right? The best way to get a handle on new criticism is to get a sense of what made it new, right? Why is it called new criticism in the first place, especially if it's 80 years old? What did the study of literature look like in the early decades of the 20th century? Okay. Now, Parker, in our textbook, actually addresses this a little bit. Consider the anecdote that Parker offers on page 15. So if you have your book, it might be worthwhile flipping to that page. Okay, so about halfway down the page, there's a paragraph that begins, "Before the new critics, many literature classrooms took no interest in the goals of criticism, as the new critics understood those goals. Teachers and students cared more about the appreciation and the performance of literature than about the criticism of it. That pattern continues in some classrooms, especially in the lower grades, or at some colleges in general education courses for non-majors, meaning for majors other than English. In that vein, and especially before the new critics, many classes gave little or no heed to criticism, and concentrated on reading the literature out loud. New critics might not object to reading aloud, but they would see it as just a beginning, as incidental to their critical goals, rather than reading aloud itself as the goal. Let me give him an example. In about 1980, I heard Maynard Mack, a distinguished critic of Shakespeare and 18th century British literature, tell a story about what college classes in English literature were like before the new critics, based on his recollection of his time as a student. He graduated from Yale in 1932. He said that a Shakespeare class in Romeo and Juliet might begin with the professor asking the students to write an account of how they once felt the way Romeo feels. And then he has an interesting parenthetical here. At Yale in those days, all the students were male. I wonder how things might have gone if they were asked to recall a time when they felt the way Juliet feels, or if they were given a choice between Romeo and Juliet. End parenthesis. A class like that usually strikes today's college students, when I tell that story, as far from what they would expect at the college level today. And in that way, it gives us a feeling for the impressionism that the new critics rebelled against, and for how dramatic a change they brought to the study of literature. Impressionism is one of the words Parker uses to talk about one of the ways of approaching literature that new criticism resisted, or tried to overcome or overturn. But whether or not we respond to Parker's description of this hypothetical Yale classroom the way his students have in the past is really beside the point. What we should take away is that what was taught in a Yale classroom had more to do with the content of Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, with how its plot made students feel, with getting them to relate personally to the events of the story, than with the play's poetic structure or style or form. Moreover, the exercise with which the hypothetical class opens concerns the mere appreciation of a timeless theme, young star-crossed love, rather than a close engagement with, and what we might now call a critical or close reading of, the singular textures or features of the play itself. And remember that Shakespeare's plays aren't just stories, right? They're written in verse. They're poems, right? They're written in verse. In addition, I mean, there are prose sections in a lot of his poems, but plays, sorry. But anyway, mostly in verse, I should say. In addition to this focus on the what of a work of literature, that is, on what it is about, on what matters to me personally, the study of poems and plays before new criticism also tended to focus, if not on the application or appreciation of their universal themes, on the life of the author, tracing the biographical source material for their poems and plays, or on the author's influences and predecessors. So if you could turn to page 13 in Parker again, he'll explain. All right, so the paragraph that begins with the italicized word history. My stomach is rumbling, I must be hungry. Anyway, history. Teachers and critics who focused the study of literature on history often concentrated on the writer's biography. So in that sense, not what we would think of as history now, but history as in mostly just sort of the local biographical history of the writer. Sometimes they focused on the writer's milieu, meaning the writer's circle of friends and of other writers and artists. Many historical critics gave special attention to studying a writer's influences and sources. For example, they might note that the British Victorian poet Alfred Lord Tennyson uses lyrical language that often echoes the lyrical language of his predecessor, the British Romantic poet John Keats, and sometimes they would go to great lengths to trace individual words or phrases, pointing out that Tennyson's words and phrases echo or repeat words and phrases from Keats, or perhaps from an earlier poet, such as Edmund Spenser, a Renaissance poet. After new criticism, this kind of source and influence study can seem arcane or dry, sort of like just a sort of like scavenger hunt, right? Although those can be fun, so I'm not really sure why he calls them dry. But anyway, and despite a gossipy exception here and there, it does not usually hold students' interest for long. Biography continues to interest readers, but many critics influenced by the new critics believe that the point is the literature itself, in the text. Again, remember, whenever a professor may prompt you, but where is it in the text, right? That's how new criticism kind of like reorganized and altered the approach to literature in the classroom anyway. In the literature itself, in the text that the new critics ask us to read closely. Skip the parenthetical for now. Sometimes, especially at the graduate level, meaning in graduate school, the historical study of literature focused on philology, that is, on the history of language, in this case English. Scholars of philology and literature study how literature shows the way languages have changed over time. To the new critics, such study offered scholarship, but not much of the criticism and interpretation that they saw as crucial for literary study. Okay. An example there would be the epic poem, Anglo-Saxon poem, Beowulf, right? Which for a long time was really just a text that was used to teach students how to learn Old English or how to learn Anglo-Saxon. And not really much attention was paid, or at least as the story goes, not much of attention was paid to the literariness of Beowulf itself as a poem, right? Until a certain guy came along and sort of shifted that a little bit and focused on the actual sort of poetic features of the epic itself. And that guy's name was J.R.R. Tolkien. Now, that's just a story. I'm not a medieval scholar, so that might be a bit misleading, but helps illustrate at least the final point Parker was making. Anyway, continuing with the lecture, unsatisfied with these approaches to literature, which always sought to explain something by linking the work of literature up with something outside of it, whether it be linking up the literature with my own experience of love at first sight, or the life of the author, or the development of language itself. A radical insistence on the immanent or inherent qualities of a particular poem or work of fiction in itself became the rallying cry of critics and professors seeking something new, thus new criticism, in the study of literature, both in the classroom and in their own scholarship. As Parker puts it on page 16, this is just a short little section, so you don't even need to turn there if you don't want to. 16, he puts it, the new critics, dismissed literary commentary that focuses on history and culture as extrinsic criticism, as not really literary criticism, because it concentrates on matters they saw as outside the literary text, and they called instead for intrinsic criticism, criticism that focuses on the text itself. Again, where is it in the text? This text-centered approach to literature is often illustrated graphically, and I sort of have this little triangle on my notes here, and I drew a triangle in class, but maybe I'll insert some annotations into the video itself. So if you draw a triangle that has sort of, well, all triangles have three points to them, but and at the very top point of the triangle, write the word text. Down here in this corner, write the word readers or audience, and over here write the word author, and then maybe in the background behind the triangle, context or history, right? Think about this triangle as a sort of visual representation of the sorts of things that might matter most to literary critics. Okay. Although this image of the triangle simplifies matters a great deal, it should help us understand how to map the new critics and their concerns in terms that they would very much appreciate, I think. That is, in spatial terms, right? Geometric terms. One should be close to the text, right? And if one is close to the text, then one is somewhat distant from a concern with one's own readerly feelings, right? Somewhat indifferent, at least initially, to the life of the author or to the culture at large in which the author is embedded. So in other words, the text itself is what should be the standard or the source of interpretation. Again, it's important to note that new critics did not think that matters of the author or the audience or even history itself were unimportant. Many of them simply argued that such matters should not be the ground of literary criticism, should not be the ground of what students themselves are learning how to do, okay? Or what they're learning to do. So who were these new critics? The most influential names that one typically uses to answer this question include Cleanth Brooks, Robert Penn Warren, William K. Wimsatt, Monroe Beardsley, Helen Vendler, among others. Critics such as I.A. Richards, William Empson, and F.R. Leavis are often cited as well, but usually as precursors with proto-new critical ideas or concepts. We should keep in mind, though, that very few of these scholars self-identified as new critics. That label, as with so many labels, has in many instances, though not in all, been retrojected onto them as a way to cluster together like-minded but still quite distinct and singular readers of literature. Parker reminds us on page 23, you don't need to turn there, it's just one sentence, quote, "Some of the new critics were friends, but they were not a set group or organized movement," end quote. It's important to keep that in mind. Beardsley, for instance, was a philosopher who had a long career in which he wrote about the aesthetics of literature, music, and painting, though he also focused occasionally, as the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy tells us, on, quote, the philosophy of history, action theory, and the history of modern philosophy, end quote. Though he never, as far as I know, I could be wrong about this, self-identified with something called New Criticism. 2 articles, which he co-authored with William Wimsatt, who I mentioned, have been canonized as foundational texts of New Criticism. One being the intentional fallacy, the other being the affective fallacy. I may talk about these in class, but Parker does give a pretty good overview of them in his book too. I might also post those essays to Sakai for those interested in reading them. Instead of spending time here and now, however, distinguishing each of the names I've just listed, many of whom don't even really self-identify as new critics anyway, it's worthwhile instead to narrow our focus down to one of the most influential of them, Cleanth Brooks. Though he authored several books about the American novelist William Faulkner and co-authored 3 literature textbooks, 2 of them with Robert Penn Warren, Brooks is perhaps most and best remembered for his seminal collection of essays on poetry and poetic theory, The Well-Wrought Urn. I don't actually have it with me here, but maybe I'll bring it to class and I can show you guys. Really quickly, since I'm moving into the next part of this lecture, on Sakai you'll find a handout with passages drawn or taken from, you can see it, taken from The Well-Wrought Urn. It might be a good idea to go download that and have that with you as you're listening to this lecture, just so you can actually see Brooks's words on the page. Okay. If we had a 16-week semester rather than a 13-week one, I probably would have had us read Brooks's book very carefully. Why? Because, for one, he is a brilliant reader of poetry. And second, far too many students and scholars tout opinions about new critics that in many cases are probably unearned. Not in all, but probably in many of them unearned. This is really a self-directed critique, though. Self-directed, meaning directed at me. For throughout most of my undergraduate and graduate studies, I always had the preconception that formalism, another name for new criticism, by the way, so I'll bounce between these two, formalism, new criticism, was nothing more than an outmoded methodology or theory. English's version of a geocentric cosmos that was displaced long ago through our own Copernican revolution. When I began preparing this lecture, however, I returned to my dusty copy of The Well-Wrought Urn, I have no idea where it is right now, and discovered for the first time that it is still a rich work of criticism and theory. Given my own recent eye-opening encounter with this book, then, I think it's worthwhile to share a few of Brooks's insights with you, though Parker does summarize a few of them in our textbook, particularly when he's going over the concepts paradox, irony, tension, and ambiguity. You might want to pay particular attention to those pages in Parker's textbook. Okay. The opening chapter of Brooks's book is titled The Language of Paradox. While it is best remembered for its lengthy reading of John Donne's poem The Canonization, Brooks actually does quite a bit more in this chapter. In fact, he develops what we might call an ontology of literary language, meaning that he makes a case for what makes poetry exist as poetry. What makes it poetry? Why is it poetry? What is it in its essence? The title of the chapter answers these questions directly. Poetic language is a language of paradox. And what is paradox? According to Parker, quote, a paradox refers to an expression that combines opposite ideas. Okay, so what does Brooks mean? In what way is poetic language a language of paradox? Okay. So I'm going to read the first quote on the handout. This is when you might want to have the downloaded document with you. Consider the first passage. So this is Brooks. Paradoxes spring from the very nature of the poet's language. It is a language in which the connotations play as great a part as the denotations. And I do not mean that the connotations are important as supplying some sort of frill or trimming, something external to the real matter in hand. I mean that the poet does not use a notation at all, as the scientist may properly be said to do so. The poet within limits has to make up his language as he goes. The poet has no one term for anything. I added the for anything, right? Has no one term. The poet must work by analogies. But the metaphors do not lie in the same plane or fit neatly edge to edge. There is a continual tilting of the planes, necessary overlappings, discrepancies, contradictions. Even the most direct and simple poet is forced into paradoxes far more often than we think, if we are sufficiently alive to what he is doing. That's Brooks, so end quote. According to Brooks, paradox is far more than a mere critical interest of his. Right? That's sort of how Parker presents it. It is not just something he looks for when he reads, right? Some sort of like riddle or, what's foul is fair and what's fair is foul, right? One of Parker's examples drawn from Shakespeare's play Macbeth, right? It's not just something he looks for, not just something like a clever line or a clever metaphor, right? Paradox is a determining factor of whether or not an example of language is poetic in the first place. He shows this not only through the use of a poem by John Donne, a contemporary of Shakespeare, but by weaving together examples from a variety of canonical British poets. William Wordsworth, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Alexander Pope, Thomas Gray, John Keats, T.S. Eliot, who's an Anglo-American poet, and of course William Shakespeare. Indeed, in his final paragraph, Brooks traces the figure of an urn, right, an urn which contains human ash, across the work of Shakespeare, Keats, and Donne, from whom Brooks's title, The Well-Wrought Urn, comes, and conjoins it, hooks it up, to the paradoxical figure of the phoenix, whose death by fire makes possible its renewal, right? So I'm sure maybe most of you know, but the phoenix is a mythological creature, a bird, right? That when it dies, it's engulfed in flames, so it's reduced to ash, and then out of the ash, it's resurrected, right? It emerges again to new life. So it's a kind of paradoxical figure of immortality, right? And an immortality that's only achieved again and again and again by way of fire and death, being reduced to ash, and then out of the ash arising again. Okay. So anyway, so what he does is he hooks up the figure of an urn across several poems by different poets, and he's going to hook that figure up, or that metaphor up, to the metaphor of the phoenix. So this is the second quote on your handout. The urn to which we are summoned in these poems, Brooks writes, is the poem itself. Right? So in other words, he wants us to think about an urn not just as an object referred to in the poems, but the urn as a metaphor for the poem itself, a poem as a container of dead ash. Right? There is a sense in which all such well-wrought urns, all such poems, contain the ashes of a phoenix. The urns are not meant for memorial purposes only, not just decorative, not frilly, not something to put on your mantelpiece, though that often seems to be their chief significance to the professors of literature. So Brooks's backhand, to other professors of literature. He continues, the phoenix rises from the ashes of these poems, or ought to rise, but it will not arise for all our mere sifting and measuring the ashes, or testing them for their chemical content. We must be prepared to accept the paradox of the imagination itself, else beauty, truth, and rarity remain enclosed in the cinders, and we shall end with essential cinders for all our pains. End quote. This passage is crucial to Brooks's own self-positioning in regard to the distinction of the study of literature from science, and the necessity of establishing a mode of reading that will make the study of literature equivalent to science in its academic importance and relevance. That's why, for instance, we often refer to the mode of reading that emerges out of new criticism as a method, right, in order to kind of parallel it with the scientific method, right, to make some sense of an objective criticism possible, although that objective criticism in literary studies is not about reproducing the same results over and over again, right? Anyway, remember, Parker does address this issue in our textbook, and you can go and read that on your own if you want. That's on page 14, right? Juxtaposing that passage from Parker and this passage from Brooks, we can see that what is really at issue in terms of evaluating the study of literature is a problem of how we read. In Brooks's own poetic words about the urn and the phoenix, it is a matter of reading poems non-scientifically. That is, in a way that provides poems with the opportunity to live again. But what does Brooks mean? In what sense does a new criticism enable a poem to come to life, to rise up out of its static memorial state? Though he does not outline this sort of criticism systematically in a step-by-step mode, it is interesting that the only clue he gives us concerns the paradox of our own imaginations. It would be wise to ponder what Brooks means here. Though most of the chapters in the well-wrought urn tend to perform rather than outline the kind of reading toward which Brooks gestures at the end of The Language of Paradox, his final chapter, The Heresy of Paraphrase, returns to a more theoretical mode of engagement with poetry. For what is it to be poetic, he asks. Where can we locate, now this is me, that was his question, these are mine. Where can we locate the poeticness of a poem? Why is paradox its necessary mode of expression? Why can't poetry be direct or clear or straightforward? And shouldn't the task of criticism be the simplification of its complexity, rather than the medium, as his metaphor of the phoenix suggests, rather than a medium through which we resurrect this complexity? In Brooks's words, this is the third quote on the handout, quote, is it not possible to frame a proposition, a statement, which will adequately represent the total meaning of a poem? That is it not possible to elaborate a summarizing proposition which will, quote-unquote, say, briefly, what the poem says as a poem, a proposition which will say it fully, and will say it exactly, no more and no less? Could not the poet, if he had chosen, have framed such a proposition? Cannot we, as readers and critics, frame such a proposition? In short, Brooks is asking, can't we just paraphrase what poems are about? And if so, why bother reading or writing or studying poetry? As you can probably guess, Brooks's answer to these questions is a resounding no. You cannot reduce a poem to one simple proposition that fully articulates and communicates the meaning of the poem, right? The meaning of the poem is the poem. It can only be said that way, according to Brooks, right? Why? Because the meaning of a poem does not reside in a single line, or a single pattern, or a single attitude, but rather in what he provisionally calls the poem's structure. or what other critics might call its form. And what is a poem's structure? Fourth quote on the handout, a short one. The rest of them are pretty short. The essential structure of a poem, Brooks writes, is a pattern of resolutions and balances and harmonizations developed through a temporal scheme, meaning from the first line to the last line, a poem is all about these complex movements and patterns of resolution, balance, and harmony among opposing ideas or contradictory ideas or discrepant ideas. From the first line to the last line, a sort of dance of these competing ideas and metaphors and images. And so landing on just one line or one word or one metaphor doesn't capture the totality of that harmony, right? And so it's only through a criticism that's capable of revivifying all of those movements, i.e. new criticism, that one can fully capture, see, experience, and articulate the full complexity of the poem's structure, the meaning of the poem as the poem itself. Okay. We see in this one definition of structure, Brooks's attempt to articulate what students and scholars of literature should be focusing on. Not on the life of an author or his or her influences, not on history or culture or the development of a language, but on the dynamic action of the poem itself, from the first line to the last line. Poems move in contradictory and surprising ways, so any attempt to sum up the complexity of its movements into a single proposition, or to locate its fundamental meaning or moral in one or two lines, betrays the very essence of what a poem is and how it expresses its meaning through the unifying work of its structure or form. A work of literary criticism, for Brooks, should, in a sense, tell the story of how the poem's ongoing activity or complexity successfully unifies or fails to unify its paradoxes, tensions, and contradictions. Consider what Brooks says about the poet's use of words. Quote 5. Rationally considered, this is Brooks, the ideal language would contain one term for each meaning, and the relation between term and meaning would be constant. But the word, as the poet uses it, has to be conceived of not as a discrete particle of meaning, but as a potential of meaning, a nexus, or a cluster of meanings. End quote. If just a single word of a poem cannot be trusted to be stable or fixed in its meaning, since it is, sorry, I think I lost my place here. Oh, no, I didn't. Since it is connotation in many cases that matters more than denotations, then how, Brooks seems to be saying, can we trust the meaning of a poem? Trust that a meaning of poem is stable or fixed? To bring a poem's activity to life, to give the phoenix its chance to be more than a lump of ash in a decorative urn, requires a nuanced, close, and careful consideration of all parts of a poem and their relation to its wholeness, to its structure. The totality of those parts is its structure. Brooks goes a bit further to say that in its dynamic activity, a poem actually manages to be a simulacrum, a copy of experience itself. Last quote. This will be the last quote from Brooks, or at least the last lengthy one. The poem, if it be a true poem, is a simulacrum of reality, by being an experience rather than any mere statement about experience or any mere abstraction from experience. If the poet then must perforce dramatize the oneness of the experience, even though paying tribute to its diversity, then his use of paradox and ambiguity is seen as necessary. End quote. Literary criticism, then, is for Brooks, is not just a matter of tinkering with poems or ignoring history or culture, right? Think of that triangle, not about ignoring the bottom points of the triangle and in order to fetishize the top point, but rather it's a matter of demonstrating how poetry itself manages to capture the dynamic multidimensionality of living experience itself. To say that Romeo and Juliet is about star-crossed forbidden love fails to explain through a careful reading and analysis of the play, how Shakespeare's poetry, how his play manages to render that love literarily into an experience of star-crossed, forbidden love, to become in itself an instance fully complex, fully contradictory, fully irrational, but fully harmonized and unified, an instance of this love in itself. And it is only through studying the structure and form of the play that we will manage to bring this experience to life. In my next video, I'm going to turn back to Parker and show review for you how he systematizes what this mode of approaching literature closely looks like. I'll say a bit about the methodology. Sorry, I keep doing that. I'm going to stop doing that. I'm going to say a bit more about what Parker has to say about the methodology of new criticism, and then we're going to look at an example of a poem that we went over on Tuesday. Okay, so I hope that was clear. If you have questions about anything I just went over, or about Brooks, or about new criticism, or about the sort of history in which it develops, feel free to write to me. But otherwise, go back over Parker's book. He gives a bit more detail regarding the history of new criticism, and also addresses some problems and concerns about new criticism that we will discuss in future classes.